Hi, my name is Paulino Caputo. I'm an artist based out of Western Canada, and I'm here today to give you a behind the scenes look at Bardlight Studios. I wanted to talk to you today about Bardlight Studios' latest game, Outclaws, which you can get right now for free on itch.io. So go check it out, see what the game's like for yourself, and then I can give you a little peek behind the curtain. I worked as the layout artist on Outclaws after doing the character sheet design for Spectacular. And when Jeremy approached me about Outclaws, he wanted to harken back to a lot of those long gone mascot games and media properties like Disney Robin Hood, which had like this playful, cartoonish, lots of like animal folk going on, like these grand adventures filled with what he correctly described as hijinks. And that became like a big focus of the design throughout the whole process. So I began by assembling this mood board that you see here of a lot of different media properties, some of which like Jeremy had passed to me, but others that I folded in to kind of build upon some of the themes visually that were going on and try and find a thread that we could pull on for the design of Outclaws. In Outclaws, you play as a band of outlaws, a bunch of little creatures in like fantasy world that are trying to go on a grand heist to rob the dragon of their treasure by infiltrating their lair on the night of the big event. When I was assembling these materials, I wanted elements that could invoke both the parallel or the binary like mirror image that the outlaws and the dragon made with each other, looking at like the natural and organic shapes, the warm colors, the kind of like sunset hues of the outlaws, as well as the more like opulent rich purples and golds of the dragons. And as I was looking at a lot of these images, I was noticing that there were ways to like thread the design, like reflect their differences, but also thread the design between these two themes in a way that felt cohesive. I began by pulling a lot of color samples from the images selected, as well as like identifying some keywords that had come up in our conversation. As I mentioned, hijinks became like a big part of that. But we also wanted something light, optimistic, cartoony, the kinds of things that you would see in like these media, whether it be games or movies, that are usually directed at more of a younger crowd. And so while they'd be going on grand adventures, there wouldn't be anything too harsh about them. There's always like this sense of like off kilter adventure that I wanted to capture. I'll also point out here that the purples, and specifically like the more neutralized purples, were really interesting to me as part of the design process because they kind of formed this thread between the warm tone hues and the cooler tones. Specifically in this image from Disney's Robin Hood, where you can see, if you look closely, let's really get in there. Why don't there are a lot of like cooler purples used to render what we would perceive of as like a brown bark. These kind of like painterly backgrounds became uh, a real like touchstone in the design process. With all of these things in place, we were able to assemble a few different color palettes, which would be able to be reassembled or like tilted in slightly different ways to evoke both the themes of the outlaws and the dragons without distinguishing them so much that they look like they're part of different games. And similarly, we wanted text that invoked that playful hijinks as well. So, especially with these first two heading typefaces here, you'll notice that none of the characters really fall on like a neat baseline. A lot of them are like elevated or descending off of that baseline more than you would usually expect in a standardized typeface. As well, there are some like sharper edges. Things are like a little bit more pokey in that way, but there's lots of rounded, playful shapes as well. And so this sense of like being slightly skewed, slightly off kilter, allowed feeling of playfulness while maintaining some of that edge that the dragon brought. And the latter two heading typefaces here instead evoked more printed press materials, the kinds of things you might see in like a newspaper. And a lot of this was drawing from the Sly franchise, which had this very like hard edge, dramatic thieving angle to it these ended up not being the pairings we went for. I believe we went closer to option 2 here, but it was an interesting avenue of exploration nonetheless. And a lot of the design process is about like exploring possibilities, like possible branches, picking which one you want to follow and putting your energy towards that. The body font, on the other hand, was important to nail down, specifically because I knew that this was going to be a very text-dense project. Outclaws entirely is based off of Lasers and Feelings and Honey Heist and other similar games, and especially with Lasers and Feelings, looking at the design of that document, you'll notice that the font is like very small. There's a huge word count placed on a single page, which I knew that we wanted to expand on slightly to make the text more accessible, but it was still important to make sure that like a density of text was there, that we were able to fit a lot of words into like a small space. And so ensuring that the text was legible at a distance, at like a small font size, meant that we had to be pretty precise about the kind of body font that we picked. And so while we went with option B here, in the final version, we actually ended up swapping out this font for something a little more, or a little less condensed, a little more spread out, to allow the words to breathe, so that way they're a bit more legible. These were some of the early sketches that I did for the layout. Whenever I'm trying to design like a character sheet or game components or whatever that looks like, I'm always thinking along a spectrum of diegesis. So what I mean by that is, to what extent is this text something that exists in the game world? Option A, for instance, thinks of the text more as something outside of the game world, and rather like the background becomes like the game world that we're peering into. Option C here instead thinks of the text as like signage on like tacked onto the tree, or like carved into a brick wall. Option B instead, the one that we ended up going with, kind of eschews both of those ideas and looks at some of the elements that we identified that were related to the outlaws and the dragons, whether that's the bark and the oak leaves, or the spikes and scales and the hoards of treasure, as more decorative elements to present the text. It's more of like a traditional presentation of text in that way, while still adding like a bit of that flavor that I like to throw into my layout. You'll see with this first example here that I did stray away from that a little bit. It's always great to show some of your rough early drafts. With this first attempt at the layout, there were a couple of challenges that we immediately identified. One was that the condensed font that we had picked was much too dense to make the text legible. And in addition, the decorative elements, well, in some ways being less legible than intended, also created too much visual noise for that small quantity of text to be legible at a distance. So you'll notice in the subsequent drafts that we actually do away with this idea entirely, and we end up bringing in this idea of the storybook. The storybook is actually coming from Disney's Robin Hood, as a way of like presenting the text in kind of a almost like as an illuminated manuscript. And so drawing in some of those influences, I went back to the drawing board and came up with our second draft here. In this draft, the font is certainly much more legible, as I instead peel back some of like these decorative elements and look again at the text as something that might exist in the world, something that is in diegesis, as it were. So thinking of these illuminated manuscripts, I ended up coming up with a couple of little page decorations, invoking some early page decorations that might be used to communicate like which page you're looking at here, but also to like invoke some of the imagery that we're calling on, as well as incorporating some of the great logo and design work by Rubery, which I ended up having some extra space for that we would fill with some more of those vector images. So thinking of the text now as a page created an opportunity to make a much cleaner, much simpler, but ultimately much more legible version of the layout, which this ended up being the path that we went for the final round. We came to the third and final layout, bringing some of the arrangement of information into parity, uh, making some tweaks with how the information is presented, and finally bringing in those vector images from Rubri to make a really cohesive spread here that gives all the information, keeps it all front and center, readily accessible for use at the table, and also subtly brings in a little bit of that printing press idea that we had kind of set aside earlier on. Looking at the 4-column layout here and on page 3, there's this feeling of like looking at newsprint, which I think is a really fun way to think about the outlaws and their what you might see after the heist, the report of their heist having gone off without a hitch, or maybe alternatively of their capture. This was a really playful and fun way to think about the text, and I feel like threading that line between newsprint and also illuminated manuscript was like a really playful way to think about the layout of this project. And that was Outclaws. So once again, you can pick that up today for free over at Bardlight Studios, and you can find more of my work at magnolian.card.co. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.